Grace and peace and mercy to you from our triune God. Amen. There's a story that Pastor Serene Jones tells about her grandma when she was a 6-year-old little girl on the Oklahoma plains in 1910. One hot day, her grandma Idabel sat on the shade in a blanket underneath the covered wagon while her parents worked the arid land with a plow pulled by a mule. The heat was terrible and the horse was miserably stamping its feet. Absently, little Idabel reached out her hand to touch the cool metal water jug that was hanging from the underbelly of the wagon. So refreshing and cool was it that she scooted over and wrapped her thin little arms around it, embracing its coolness with her entire body. In today's Bible story, the Israelites are wandering through the wilderness and they are desperate for water. You know that if there is no water in the group, then people are not feeling exactly copacetic. They are fighting all the time and they're blaming Moses, who quarrels back with them. Everybody has been in the wilderness for a little while now and they are just worn out. In the past, it had been pretty easy for the Israelites to spot God. God was very dramatic and exciting. Remember all of the plagues? Or when God just opened up the Red Sea and they walked right through? There was another point where there was this pillar of light blazing in front of them and leading them. God was very obvious back then. But at this point in the story, the desert is losing its charm and the people are done with this wilderness and starting to wonder, is God even here? You know when you feel like your connection to God is a little thin? When life is cruising along just fine, God is one of those things that is also just cruising along fine. You know, I'm good, God's good, we're good. Then life throws you for a loop and bam, you're in the wilderness. In a doctor's office with a loved one, or applying for unemployment, or homeschooling your kids, or watching the news headlines with increased dread. It's a wilderness, and suddenly you're not entirely sure where in the world God is, or if God even is. Back in Egypt, before Pharaoh actually let God's people go, Moses was resistant to this idea of being the one who was in charge. He didn't think that people would believe him, that God was actually trying to liberate the people. So God gave him this shepherd's staff, this concrete object. And at one point, God changed this shepherd's staff into a serpent. And another point, Moses struck the Nile River with it, and the river turned into blood. God's promise that the Israelites would make it out of Egypt and to the promised land was attached to this very concrete and everyday thing, to the shepherd's staff. It was an ordinary thing that was sacred, kind of like a sacrament. This shepherd's staff reminded everyone that God would follow through on that promise to get them to the promised land. In today's reading, just when everyone is starting to freak out, God goes back to Moses and says, Moses, strike this rock using the shepherd's staff and you will have water for the people. I will be standing there in front of you, God says. Moses strikes the rock and the people have water. Today we will baptize little Owen McMillan using water, this everyday, ordinary thing that is somehow sacred with God's presence. Now, we didn't plan to baptize little Owen in the middle of this wilderness time that we are living in as a society. But now that we are, it is a reminder to us. Today, as we baptize little Owen, we remember that we are also beloved to God. Even if the wilderness is uncomfortable, we're still beloved. Even if we are anxious and undone in the wilderness, we are still beloved. The kind of love that cuts through the wilderness isn't sentimental, but it is strong and saving, and it brings water out of a rock. Learning to trust this kind of love is a journey of the soul, which people have walked for millennia before us. Today we will actually celebrate Owen's baptism, but it's not every day that we have a baptism in the church. When we don't have a baptism, we can still look for real things in the world that are sacred signs of God's grace. Like we look at water in a baptism as a sacred sign of God's grace. God says to Moses in this Bible story, I will be standing there in front of you. What is the grace that is standing in front of you right now, today? God's real presence. Maybe it's the miracle of love from our friends and family that sustains us right now. Maybe it's a simple thing like a daily walk outside or the first signs of the beauty of fall that remind us of God's grace in the world. Maybe it is giving thanks for the grace of the most delicious end of the summer tomato that you have just cut into. Maybe it is the sound of birdsong or crickets. Maybe it is the ding of a text message from someone you love. Maybe it was a difficult or provocative conversation with someone. Maybe, like it was for little Idabel out on the hot Oklahoma plain, it is a cool jug of water after a jog or a bike ride or a baseball game. When Idabel recounted that story to her granddaughter, she said that when she hugged that cool jug of water, she felt like she was touching God or hugging God. That ordinary thing was actually sacramental. These are sacred things that remind us of God's presence in the wilderness. God's presence when we make a meal for someone we love, when we care for a patient or a student, when we give an offering to the church, when we pause to notice the sun on our faces or the breath moving in our bodies. This is the grace of God. This story from Exodus is an old one, and it's not always a pretty one because we humans fail and make a lot of dumb mistakes in the story. But we have been telling this story for thousands of years around campfires and in cathedrals and whispered late at night to the ones that we love. It's more than the story of a wilderness or even the cross. It is a story of a love that refuses to be buried by fear or extinguished in a cave of death with a stone rolled in front of it. It is a story of a grace that constantly surprises us, like water coming out of a rock, and provides for us. And it is a story of a love that is steady, and of a God that says, my beloved, I will be standing right there in front of you. Sometimes the story is only the faintest whisper in the depths of who we are, but it is there. It is a story of grace in the wilderness and of a God who makes good on the promise of life. Blessed be the journey.